We're live.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you out on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on policing, race, and universities. I'm Adam Getacho, and I'll be moderating today's discussion, which is hosted by Scholars for Social Justice, or SSJ. SSJ is a network of scholars initiated in the summer of 2017, committed to promoting and fighting for a political agenda that insists upon justice for all, especially the most vulnerable. The network emerged from the confluence of rising activism around racial and economic justice, exemplified by the movement for Black Lives, and the explicitly racist and authoritarian drift of national politics under Donald Trump. Comprised of scholars inside and outside the academy, the network is part of the Rising Majority, a Black and people of color-led national coalition of over 80 social justice organizations. SSJ has two broad aims. First, it seeks to support movement activists and organizers by leveraging the resources of universities through political education and research. Second, SSJ aims to transform the university context towards greater equity and justice by bringing to bear the analysis and organizing of social movements into the space of the university. Today's conversation is an example of this second aim. The nationwide uprising of the last month that followed the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Tony McDade have brought to wider attention the decades-long struggle for prison abolition. Universities are directly implicated in this country's history of policing, and this moment is a ripe one to ask what role policing has played in university contexts, and how we might reimagine safety and community in settings of higher education. Before introducing our panelists, let me say a couple of words about the history of policing in universities. The first campus police department was established more than a century ago at Yale University, but like their city counterparts, they would be expanded beginning in the 1960s. The immediate context of that expansion was student activism and the resulting conflicts with local police, a prominent example of which was the deadly Kent State shooting in 1970. To manage an assumed need for law enforcement, college presidents began lobbying for state legislation that would allow the creation of police departments on campus. Their efforts were largely successful. As of 2015, over 44 states now allow colleges to have campus police forces. 92% of public colleges and universities have sworn and armed officers. Unsurprisingly, they're much less prevalent in private universities, where 38% of them are equipped with their own law enforcement. Since the 2004-2005 school year, the percentage of both public and private colleges nationwide using armed forces increased from 68% to 75%. In keeping with national trends, what is striking about this growth is that it actually coincides with a decline in crime on campus. After the passage of the Clery Act in 1990, colleges and universities had to track, compile, and disclose crimes on and near campus, providing timely notifications of safety threats. Clery Act data shows that violent crime rate on college campuses between 2004 and 2011 went down 27%, while property crimes went down by 35%. In the meantime, more and more sworn officers, including those outfitted with firearms, chemical or pepper spray, taser-like devices, and in some cases military-grade equipment, were added to college campuses. Campus police typically act as independent law enforcement agencies and enjoy expanding authority. 8 out of 10 college police can patrol off-campus areas, and they can make arrests. They have these powers without the same public reporting requirements as municipal police, and they typically only report to university presidents or high-ranking officials. Now, in recent years, university police have been involved in fatal shootings at the University of Cincinnati, at San Jose University, and at University of the Incarnate Word, a private Catholic institution. University police have also aggressively responded to protests, for instance, deploying pepper spray during protests in the University of California system. As of 2017, there were over 52,000 arrests on campuses at 6,000 institutions. So this is a real moment to ask why we have police on campus and what it means to defund university police. So to discuss this, the history and practice of policing on campus, and to consider what divesting and investing from university police might mean, we're joined by a group of amazing scholars, organizers, and student activists. So I'll briefly introduce them in the order that they are going to speak. Then they'll say a few words to open our discussion. We encourage all our audience members to submit questions through the chat, and we'll get to them after. So first we have Davarian Baldwin, a professor of American Studies at Trinity College in Connecticut. He is the author of the forthcoming book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower: How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. Next, we'll hear from Robin Kelly, the Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA, where he teaches Black Studies and History. Then we'll hear from Kosi Achife, a core member of UChicago United, a coalition of multicultural organizations fighting for racial justice at the University of Chicago. She was previously Student Government Vice President of Student Affairs and a founding member of Reclaim Our Gift, an initiative that funnels university money to Black grassroots organizations on the South Side. Joining her is Michelle Yang, a student organizer also with UChicago United, and has been organizing with UFC's Care Not Cops campaign for the last 3 years. They're currently organizing the Chicago Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. Finally, we'll close with Barbara Ransby, a historian, writer, and longtime activist. She is a distinguished professor of African American Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she also directs the campus-wide social justice initiative. So I'll turn it over to Davarian now.
So first of all, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, depending on where you're located. It's really a blessing and an honor to be here with all these amazing scholars and activists and everyone that's attending as a part of the broader community. So I've been tasked with kind of situating policing within the larger processes of gentrification in our cities. And so as, you know, over this weekend, this important weekend, we're gonna say a lot of names, but I wanna add a couple of names that are not normally included in that record. Tyrone West, Morgan State, Baltimore. LeVar Douglas, Coppin State, Baltimore. Stephanie Washington, Yale, New Haven. Charles Sonji Thomas, UChicago. Kelly Brinson, Lorenzo Collins, Everett Howard, and Samuel DuBose, University of Cincinnati. These are just a few of the names of people of color who have either been shot and most of them killed at the hands of campus police. All of these university police forces have jurisdiction beyond their immediate campuses, some with jurisdiction over the entire city. All are armed police forces with public authority and no, let me repeat, no public oversight whatsoever. And they are not only surveilling our communities, but they're killing us. What the hell is going on? The assaults here on Black life were not even matters of public safety, but conflicts over what the French theorist Henri Lefebvre calls the right to the city. Our schools spent decades of building institutional walls and bulldozing city blocks to fortify the divide between ivory towers and the largely brown working class communities that surround these campuses. Now schools are stretching their legs, attempting to assert their authority in cities largely driven by a knowledge economy where academic research is used to create a profitable commercial goods in a range of fields, from the pharmaceutical industries and software products to military defense spending and weaponry. Key to recruiting the best students, faculty, and their families to do this work is the creation of an urban cluster of housing, retail, and nightlife right in the middle of existing communities of color. It's not an accident that in almost all cases, the jurisdiction of university police extends to the areas targeted for campus expansion. In these campus zones, we find an intense surveillance of Black and brown behavior to prepare the space for creating university citadels, what we call gentrification. In this current moment, we can see how schools have become a parastate. They govern parts of our cities by deploying the brute strength of campus police alongside the soft power of campus building to enact a violent confiscation and control of our cities. And the results have been dehumanization and sometimes death for Black communities. How did we get here? How did this come about? Well, Ladon was great about kind of laying out some of the basic history. I just want to add a couple facts to that conversation. More than 100 colleges also got armed to the teeth with military grade weapons from the notorious Department of Defense 1033 program, made popular or made visible by after Ferguson. And while these armed police forces move further off campus, most states protect them from the state's Freedom of Information Act. So in the name of campus safety, our communities of color around campuses have become especially dangerous pressure points around the broader politics of police violence. Many schools look to the University of Chicago as the perfect model for how to design this policing. And we're going to hear from the amazing folks at Carry Not Cops in a minute. But I just want to point out that their predecessors, the Campaign for Equitable Policing, they identified a draconian pattern of racial profiling and a two-tier policing system. Here, a student and a community member are accused of the same infraction. The student meets with the dean. The resident is shuttled through the criminal justice system. Last year, Johns Hopkins pushed for a private police force. They looked to use Chicago as a model, but residents and students saw horror. State Senator Mary Washington called a private security force led by Johns Hopkins as nothing more than a Vatican City in the middle of Baltimore. Students and residents staged a month-long sit-in where they directly identified such campus policing tactics as the first stage of gentrification. Universities have signaled a major shift. No longer bunkering down behind ivory towers, they have embraced a velvet hammer approach to expansion. Upscale housing and retail follow behind a militarized version of the campus police who privatize our communities for university interests. Students and residents, however, they hold firm, fighting for a right to remain.
Robin? Oh, we can't hear you.
Right.
Okay, unmuted. Okay, okay, thank you very much. So first, very quickly, I just want to mention that this is more of a report back of the work that we're doing in the UC Divest Invest Collective. And just to be clear, I'm going to talk about the work as a collective. I'm not going to mention any names. You know our names by our signatures. And I want to first credit our graduate students at UCLA for exposing the collaboration between the LAPD and UCLA anthropologist Jeffrey Brantingham on so-called predictive policing. And because of the work that the students did, they succeeded in April of forcing the LAPD to disband its LASER program, which is Los Angeles Strategic Extraction and Restoration Program, which is basically a kind of racial profiling algorithm. And so part of that speaks to the way that university research supports policing throughout the city. But the point here is that there was already groundwork being laid before this eruption of struggle, trying to break the ties between the university and police. So the Divest Invest UCLA Faculty Collective was formed in response to UCLA allowing the LAPD to use Jackie Robinson Stadium as a massive jail. They basically used the field to detain protesters and process those who were arrested for protesting. And initially the administration claimed ignorance, like we didn't know anything about it. And then later they said it was a mistake. So we're calling on the chancellor to hold a public hearing on detentions and to establish a compensation fund for any protesters who are facing criminal charges during their arrests and detainment in the stadium, and to drop all disciplinary actions against students who participated in the Black Lives Matter protests and UC for COLA protests. But that's just the beginning. So UCLA was already losing its credibility because of its ongoing silence and complicity in promoting racism. And I don't have time to talk about it, but it's a long history of campus police beating down, detaining Black students. And so there's that. What we're calling for is an end to UCLA's relationship with the LAPD and all county, state, and federal police departments and security agencies. I mean, because we recognize that as long as UCLA collaborates with the LAPD and other police forces, it is responsible for police brutality and racialized state violence. We're also calling for defunding UCPD and to replace it with anti-carceral forms of accountability, including restorative and transformative justice, and community-centered and led models of public safety. And of course, the other aspect is to redirect those resources from policing toward racial and gender justice teaching, research, community initiatives, and to support Black faculty, staff, students, and workers on campus. The demand for divest, invest is widely supported across campus. We got support from the Black Student Graduate Association, which really led a lot of this campaign, the African Student Union, Black faculty and staff, calling for things like a Black Resource Center, more faculty lines, fellowship support. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's a bunch of initiatives all coming at once. The insurgency has led to certain demands for more resources for ethnic studies, Black studies, gender studies, but with those resources, at the top of the list, in most cases, is divest from the police and invest. Students issued a similar letter. They got over 7,500 signatures, and heads of ethnic studies centers, others. And what we asked the administration to do was to commit to divestment by Juneteenth. So we're on a moving train right now. Things are happening as we speak. Things are happening as of a couple hours ago. So of course, Juneteenth comes, and what do we get? An incredibly anemic response to the demands for divestment. And then of course, crumbs in response to the invest side, in other words, resources for Black studies, ethnic studies, gender studies. So before I elaborate on their response, let's just keep in mind some facts. UCLA just completed its most successful capital campaign in history. It raised over $5 billion. Let me just make sure, because sometimes when I speak, it's not clear. It's not million, $5 billion. $5 billion. Okay, that's one point. Secondly, UCLA's annual budget for its own police force rose from $12.7 million annually in 2009-10 to $20.8 million in 2018-19, okay? And the starting salaries for UCPD officers is slightly higher than that of beginning assistant professors. Not to say change of profession, but So with respect to just their response to divestment, they offered no such response to divestment. Instead, they offered a proposal for reform that is almost identical to Trump's executive order on safe policing for safe communities. So it's wrapped in this kind of corporate language of diversity. It promises to review the campus relationship with other police forces, to discuss new protocols like joint training between UCPD and, say, the LAPD, clarifying jurisdictions, implicit bias training, learning effective means of de-escalation. In other words, all these things that don't work, we know that. So in the end, their response was basically, we're not going to reduce our budget, we're going to increase our investment in the UCPD in general. So like I said, this is a fast moving train. We're in struggle right now, but let me just leave you with two notes, two very important notes. One is hopeful and one is cautionary. The hopeful note is that we have massive support, broad support on our campus for divestment and across the UC system. I mean, just And by the way, if you have a chance, check out the UC-wide statement issued by Justice for Black Lives Coalition, which is very, very powerful, includes ending policing, divest from companies that profit off of Israel's colonial occupation of Palestine, and returning indigenous lands and material relatives to their indigenous communities. So that's that. But so that's like the broad possibility. There's a lot of support across the board. The cautionary tale, or the cautionary note, which I'll leave you with, has to do with something that many of us who are old as me have seen, and that is the potential for the administration to split our ranks. And they do this all the time. They offer resources for Black studies and ethnic studies in exchange for discarding the demands to abolish the police. And it's presented as a kind of zero-sum game. Like, well, if you really want these resources, like that other thing is dreamlike. It's not possible, but we will give you faculty lines and more money and better offices and, a corner office. And that's the kind of thing that's actually happening right now. That is, the question is, who's going to go for the bribe, or who's going, and are we going to hold on for real structural change? I'm confident that the latter will happen. We'll hold on, but this is a problem that we're going to face across the country, because I've seen it before, and this is not the last time the universities have used, our quest, our hunger for resources against a struggle for real change and for making our community safer. Thanks.
Okay, next we'll have Kosi and Michelle.
Cool. So we're from Care Not Cops at UChicago. So just like a brief about of Care Not Cops. So Care Not Cops is like a collaborative campaign between Student Working Against Prisons and UC United. We were formed 2 years ago after the shooting of Charles Thomas, who was then a fourth year. And yeah, I don't know, Kosi, you want to go into UC? Wait, you're muted.
Yeah, so a little bit about UC United. As Adam mentioned, we are a coalition of multicultural organizations. So think the Organization of Black Students or Organization of Latin American Students. We're fighting for racial justice, not just on campus, but we're also aware of the injustices that UChicago has done in the surrounding Southside neighborhoods. So as I think Baldwin and Kelly mentioned, thinking gentrification, over-policing of the area, UCPD's massive jurisdiction way beyond the borders of the UChicago campus. And one thing that we always want to stress, is that we are an organizing group. So not just speaking up on issues, but we are doing base building. We are doing collective leadership and circular leadership. We seek to build power among students and faculty and staff to confront the university as an institution that wields an unduly amount of power over our lives. And so we just recently did an action in order to ultimately disband and abolish UCPD, and Michelle can go deeper into the demands.
Yeah, so when we formed out of 2 years ago, our end goal was always to abolish UCPD, and we really saw it in connection with abolishing larger PIC, policing, nationally and globally. So this past week, we released 4 specific demands. So one was to defund calling the university to defund UCPD by 50% in the next fiscal year, for them to disarm UCPD. So that includes tasers, which they only recently brought on, I think 1 or 2 years ago. For the university to disclose the budget of UCPD and the whole safety and security department for the last 20 years and every year moving forward, and then to release a plan by October of how they're going to disband the UCPD by 2022. And I just want to mention, because I think it's important that Care Not Cops, we're not just thinking, we don't just think about our work in terms of abolishing UCPD, we're also really thinking about how are we you know, like killing the cops in our head and like undoing oppression internally and interpersonally. So UChicago has this like really toxic culture of stress and isolation that I think is probably not unique to UChicago. But this kind of culture, right, like it really promotes like policing ourselves and each other to conform to like ridiculous standards and buy into like, you know, the dominant narratives at UChicago of like, you know, what is a future that is like for college students like us, and really like trying to move us towards becoming kind of like the bureaucrats of the system that we're in. And so what we really want to do is that we want to be building like healthier community cultures where we center our abilities to like change and transform. Because like we really believe that like communities like know how to take care of themselves. Like that's for students and that's for also the surrounding communities on the South Side. It's a university that's actively preventing them from being able to like care for themselves. So that's why I really think about like we need to be redistributing money and power. And like, so like what we don't need is for the university to kind of like invest in community through their like set of like nonprofits, like the arts incubator and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I'll go a little bit on our action. I got quite a bit of coverage over the past week. So essentially we took UCPD's headquarters for about 20 hours. It started off with a rally in the center of the quad. We had speakers from Asada's Daughters, Good Kid, Mad City, and Jess Vargas, who's a native Southside Chicagoan and CPS alum who, like many community members, has a stake in UCPD's existence. And then we also had Soji Thomas speak, and that was sort of the original student who was shot by UCPD and like started the Care Not Cops campaign. After that, we marched from the center of the quad to UCPD headquarters, where we occupied the space for, like I said, over 20 hours. And not necessarily in our plan, we were locked in. We couldn't go outside the front door, only the back. And if we wanted to leave, we'd not be allowed back in. They prevented us from using the bathroom. That's UCPD and upper administration of the university. Prevented us from using the bathroom and prevented any food from coming inside. So under these like really straining, draining conditions, though, we were still able to sort of like create a space of community and of care both inside and outside of HQ. So there's a lot of singing, a lot of dancing, so much art was being made, fun chants, which included rapping Super Bass. Nicki Minaj, who every hour or 30 minutes, a police officer, UCPD officer would come in and sort of like read this like standardized script, like yell the standardized script about sort of like we're trespassing and all this stuff, but they would do it way into the early hours of the night, so they kept us from sleeping as well. But through all that, pretty much if you ask anybody about that experience, we really were able to materialize the future that we want to see without police. There was even an autonomous zone made outside that was really big. So, and we're happy to sort of like do something so outwardly about like the future that we want to create, and then also inspire others, student activists, to, you know, be bold in their actions and be bold in their activism.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to Barbara, and again, feel free to continue to add your questions to the chat.
Right. Well, it's wonderful to be on this panel this morning. I mean, what a Juneteenth weekend this is. I'm inspired listening to all of you, the students especially. You're going to run this race and fight this fight longer than we will. So, you know, no pressure, but we're counting on you. I'm going to say a little bit. I want to reiterate some of the things that Adam said at the outset in terms of Scholars for Social Justice and this event today. Appreciating my colleagues Robin Kelly and Devarian Baldwin for laying out the particulars at UCLA, and Devarian for giving us a kind of historical overview. Adam said that SSJ is a 3-year-old organization. We have about 500 members, and I'm not sure if you mentioned that part of it, but we're very proud of that, because what it says is that there are a lot of academics and independent scholars who are eager for this kind of organization. If you're listening right now, let us know who you are, give us a shout out, give us your contact information. We are deliberately organizing outside of the official boundaries of our academic appointments and our academic institutions, because we want to do this differently. This is insurgent intellectual work in service to a movement. It is in service to, it's inspired by, it's in support of the leadership of young people like Kosi and Michelle, but also the young people in the movement for Black Lives who yesterday organized events all over this country, some of them under Movement for Black Lives banner, some of them spontaneous, beautifully independent, in response to this current moment of crisis. And the moment of crisis is a convergence of several crises, right? So we have what we have in the White House. I mean, that alone is a crisis. A very dangerous, incompetent, mean-spirited, vicious, authoritarian wannabe, right? And he's moving in the direction of more and more authoritarian measures, using white nationalism and white supremacy and racism as one of his weapons and his tools. That's a very dangerous situation for us and for our people. We also then have the COVID pandemic, which has caused enormous loss of life. And I have to say, you know, while pandemics and hurricanes and all kinds of unpredictable disasters, you know, are things that we can't necessarily prevent, how we're prepared to deal with them depends on the kind of policies we have in place and the kind of priorities our society sets. Racial capitalism is not designed to help us survive this kind of pandemic, right? Because pharmaceutical companies, for example, you know, they want drugs that are profitable. They want high blood pressure medication and diabetes medication. You got to take it all the time. Why? You got to buy it all the time. Having a vaccine for a pandemic that might come every decade or so is just not lucrative. Not to mention the fact that the president disbanded the government office that was supposed to do disaster planning for this kind of thing. Added to that is the fact that hospitals and states and local municipalities have had to actually compete with each other on the open market for life-saving devices like ventilators. So we have the COVID crisis, we have the presidential crisis, and then we have this moment of rebellion and uprising, not unrelated to the other two crises. Triggered by the vicious murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis 3 weeks ago, but representing so much more than that. I think when many of us saw that video of George Floyd being murdered in broad daylight with the police, you know, Derek Chauvin looking directly into a camera saying, I have the power to do this. I have the power to kill this man in front of you. I have the power to determine who lives and who dies. That kind of racist state power is what people went to the streets to protest, but it is compounded by the economic violence that we see in all of the policies coming out of this government, right? So in response to that, unprecedented uprisings all over this country, every single state. Hawaii and Alaska had protests. Oklahoma had protests. North Dakota had protests. Utah had protests. Everywhere, right? So even more than at the height of the protests in the 1960s, partly fueled by social media and other ways of protesters communicating, we have an unprecedented moment of uprising. It is a dangerous moment in some ways because we don't know what the outcome will be. And we have a government ready to press the repression button even harder, ready to take, really ready to bring in the military. I mean, we saw what happened in Washington, D.C. to peaceful protesters outside the White House. And we don't know what's going to happen in Tulsa today with this mega Trump rally. But it is also a moment of enormous possibility. And I'm determined to hang on. I mean, you know, there's a quote from Gramsci, as people know very well, you know, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And I'm hanging on with a rugged determination to that optimism, because I do believe it is an opportunity for us to think outside the box, to think of new possibilities, to look at the ways in which the current policies and systems have failed us, and to imagine, and not only imagine, but to build something better. So yesterday on Juneteenth, Movement for Black Lives called for a weekend of action. There were thousands of people in Washington, thousands of people in Atlanta, thousands of people in Oakland and San Francisco, thousands of people going across the Brooklyn Bridge. Dock workers shut down the port in Oakland. Enormous protests, a beautiful solidarity statement from around the world as a half-page ad in the New York Times yesterday, affirming the struggle for Black lives. I also want to say that the struggle for Black lives is not just about Black lives. I think Robin wrote this in Boston Review in 2016 when he talked about the document that came out of the movement for Black lives, the vision document, it's Vision for Black Lives document. And near the end of that document, it says, and Robin reiterated this, to fight for the value of Black life, and I would say particularly poor and working class Black people, the people who have been abandoned by the system, the people who have been incarcerated in unprecedented numbers, to affirm the value and importance and centrality of Black, poor, and working class lives is to make a path for greater freedom for everyone, without a doubt. So that is what the movement has embraced, calling for 3 demands in this moment. One is to defund the police, to take that power, really the power that Derek Chauvin demonstrated on the streets of Minneapolis, but also financial power and resources away from police forces, some of which make up 30% of city budgets, 40% in Chicago. But to take that money and then to reinvest in our people, to defund police and to fund people, to fund the needs that people and communities have, mental health centers, schools, etc. These are the things that will keep us safe. These are the things that will keep us healthy. These are the things that we can build a future on, a future that we can be proud of. So that's what they're demanding. And the third demand is that the current occupant of the White House resign. Now, we don't think that he will willingly resign. A lot of people have resigned, different heads of state have resigned when they didn't want to, right? If the movement is big enough and strong enough. But we want to mobilize people to say he is not our president, right? And he should not be our president. He should resign. He has done so much damage and so much harm and putting us all in so much danger, right? We want to indict Trump and Trumpism because it's bigger than an individual. But if he doesn't resign, we want to say we want to retire him in November. So we want to link those 3 demands, and I think all of them are integrally related. All of them are very important. One without the other really does not get us to where we want to be. I also think we need to revisit something that Scholars for Social Justice have talked about for several years now, which is the issue of reparations. And that can come in a number of forms, but to repair means to reinvest. To repair means to redistribute. To repair means to reimagine social relations of power in our society. And so the model of reparations is one I think we ought to embrace as well. So I think I'll stop there. I feel like I'm preaching and it's not Sunday morning. So I'm gonna stop and let us have some time for conversation and discussion and really rejuvenating ourselves, because this is not the end. Getting free is a process. I wrote something about Juneteenth yesterday, and Juneteenth is that moment in Galveston, Texas, when 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, formerly enslaved people were told that they were, quote unquote, free. But it's a misleading narrative, because getting free is always about the agency of those who are unfree. Right? Nobody frees you, you free yourself. And freedom is a process. So we're on that freedom road, we're in that freedom process. The pace and step has accelerated, and we got to do what we have to do to keep up with it. So I'll stop there and hopefully we'll have some discussion.
Great. Before we turn to questions, I want to say 2 ways that people can get involved. So one is that Scholars for Social Justice has a statement out on university policing that we invite folks to sign. The link has been posted a couple of times, but I'm sending it on the chat one more time. The other thing is, for scholars who want to be a member of the network, you can email us, and the email, we'll put the email also on the chat, but it's scholarssocialjustice@gmail.com. We also have a website, scholarsforsocialjustice.com. So we'll put that information in the chat, and we hope you will join us and be part of this network of building connection between scholars and wider movements for social justice. So there's—
Can I just add just a little, if people also want to know more about Movement for Black Lives or Rising Majority, they can go to risingmajority.org or movementforblacklives.org online. And also 619.com is the website for this weekend's activities.
Great. So we have a number of questions, and I want to start with one that a couple of people have brought up, and it's one that a lot of advocates and organizers for abolition are faced with, which is, what do we do with the question of violence and harm? And this question has come up in two specific ways: one around the prevalence of sexual violence on campuses and around Title IX issues. And then second, the question of campus shootings, which have also occurred during this period. So how do we respond when our colleagues or others say we need police given these forms of violence on our campuses?
I can start. I've done a lot of stuff with Title IX and sexual assault awareness and prevention on campus. And I just want to say, like, point blank period, that like UCPD is not helpful in those situations. And so any sort of thinking that like maybe UCPD, like we need police on campus just to like, or to help like address these issues with sexual assault on campus is just like not. I've talked to so many survivors. I like, for example, one of my friends, she was in a really abusive relationship and her boyfriend threatened to kill her. She called UCPD and they were like, well, there's nothing we can do, right? And even thinking of the Title IX process within universities, it is so daunting and tasking on survivors. And so going back to sort of what Care Not Cops and what, at least on the undergraduate side, thinking of ways to not necessarily like focus on the punishment aspect of the perpetrator, but how can we think of transformative justice when it comes to giving survivors a chance to heal and giving survivors a chance to continue their time in college with like proper mental health services, with proper therapy, with proper trauma-informed care. How can we get professors to sort of like be on their sides and help be an advocate? UCPD and police, campus police is just like not nor ever helpful in those situations. Or thinking of like fraternity parties. This year at UChicago, we started with, I think it was 2 fraternities doing mass druggings on girls in sororities or just like young underclassmen girls. And there's really no one, like UCPD didn't investigate it. You know, it just sort of happened and there was no sort of like accountability, right? But you still have these young women who their lives took a really big hit at the beginning of the school year. So thinking of not necessarily like, again, like the cop in our head and like carceral logic and punishment, really focusing on the survivor and like really focusing those like most harmed. Oh, and even then UCPD and police writ large like have a history of abusing, of disregarding the stories of survivors. And
I think, thank you for that, Kosi. I mean, that was really, the perfect answer. I think also prevention is real, that we need to think of ways that we can prevent harmful and dangerous situations from occurring. And there's a myriad of ways to do that. Mariam Kaba had a great piece in the New York Times last weekend, which talked about restorative justice work and also the harm that often occurs when we call the police. I think people have a notion in their mind about what calling the police will do. And also, depending on who you are, that plays out differently. Black students on predominantly white campuses call the police and it's like, are you a suspect? Do you belong here? Do you have your ID? There's an assumption of who's guilty in those situations. And what cops are trained to do, cops come with guns. Cops come with kind of warrior mentality. In fact, many police forces, get this sort of warrior training. And that does not make people feel safer in those circumstances. Now, there are circumstances where you might require some kind of intervention that is very specialized to to disarm someone, to talk someone down who's having a mental break, to keep a community safe and to keep that person safe. But that is not what 95% of police work is on or off campuses. And I think coming to terms with that allows us to entertain this reallocation of resources that we're calling for.
I'll just say that, well, just real briefly, right before all of these uprisings that took place and a much more radical approach to campus policing and policing more broadly, I was speaking to Senator Washington in Baltimore about the struggles with Johns Hopkins trying to push forward their police force. And one thing that kept coming up was the over-policing of Black communities surrounding Johns Hopkins and the under-policing of sex and sexual violence and drug and alcohol abuse that's largely a white crimes on campus, and how that needed to be addressed in a more public way, that the kind of Bacchanalian terror that was being allowed on campuses was just being made invisible to any kind of public conversation because of the brand of the college in the larger higher education marketplace. And so, but she also made a point that many of these institutions are tied to these phenomenal medical schools and medical centers. And at the very modest level, at least, what would it mean to have a campus police officer paired with a public health professional or public health student, and kind of shifting the conversation around, you know, the lack of need for an armed response to every kind of encounter. And that's a very modest thing, and people have gone beyond that in the last couple of weeks. But even then, there was this idea about how can we marshal the resources and the expertise that universities do offer to think differently around public safety and health.
Great. So there's also a few questions around, you know, we're calling for defunding the police. What sorts of things would you like to see investments in on campuses? So where should those resources be spent? And I wonder if you guys can talk about this, especially in relationship to the austerity context that we are all in, that we are in as a country, and each of our institutions are in, given the fallout of the COVID crisis. So what does it mean to call for defunding in this moment? How do we shift that austerity discourse of our institutions to get the resources in the places we need them most?
Who wants to take that one? I mean, I think, you know, I mean, part of what it takes is organizing. You know, we've seen universities shift more and more toward neoliberal models of austerity and to function more and more like corporations. And we have to resist that. Teachers and students, you know, we come together to figure things out, to create new knowledge, to embrace curiosity, and hopefully contribute to making the world a better place. But that gets overshadowed by a lot of financial imperatives that the universities choose to embrace, by, you know, business schools and big health centers that really do, you know, run like corporations. And so I think resisting the tyranny of those priorities is really important. And what's happening in the world. I mean, universities like to think of themselves as ivory towers, but they are embedded in particular time and place. And in this particular time, in this particular place, there is no ignoring what is happening in the streets. Our faculty, our students and staff are involved in it, and universities have to respond to that. Now, you know, we can talk about a myriad of things that finances, you know, that university finances could be devoted to other than police. Services to students, reducing tuition so the students aren't in such, terrible debt when they get out of college. Creating more programs that engage communities so that campuses are not fortresses in communities, particularly urban communities. I mean, all of these are avenues for resources to rethink and to really democratize education, which should be our goal. I'll let somebody else add to that.
I'll just jump in very quickly. One thing is that there's no shortage, I mean, just like Barbara was saying, there's no shortage of proposals and plans and institutions that need support. In fact, just at UCLA, we have some amazing proposals. The Black Feminism Initiative, for example, which is directed by Sarah Haley, produced a bunch of demands for resources. And what I think is different is that some of these resources are not the typical resources. Typically, we go for faculty lines. Like, we want faculty lines, we want funding for students, but there are other things that really are about not just expanding the existing structure, but changing it. And I think we have to think in those terms. And also, just to reiterate something Barbara said, we need to move towards zero tuition, period. The mere fact that people have to pay for college, that's a crime in itself. And so if we have billions going to police people and nothing to open up, I mean, really open up the university, ending tuition, open admissions, changing the criteria by which people can be entered, could be admitted to university, really matters. And one last thing, I didn't say anything about the first question because the answers were just right on point, and I don't need to reiterate that, but I can say that UCLA is the poster child for how to not deal with Title IX issues. And so we have, so part of that story has to do with a flawed structure, that policing is not just the actual physical police of the UCPD doing its work. It's also about the way the administration first goes after protecting its interests. That litigation is one of the ways, and also silencing victims of sexual violence. This is how the university operates, and that has to change. And that's way beyond just what happens in the direct encounters between police officers and victims and perpetrators.
I just will add very briefly that I think that we need to have a complete reckoning with the full reach of universities' power in our political economy, particularly in my case in terms of cities. Just the basic fact that universities are the largest employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and policing agents in major cities all across the country. And so the pandemic made it very clear that when people's lives were shut down and economic deprivation swept in, many of these people who were not students were tied, and not faculty, were tied to the political economy of universities as frontline workers, as low-wage workers, in various as residents in university-owned housing. There are a number of ways in which universities touch so many aspects of our lives. And a lot of this is being masked or made invisible because we are not doing enough. And of course, we know to do community organizing and social action. We also got to do a lot of more research. We still don't have enough information. When we talk about austerity or the limits of university budgets, we are only talking about maybe 1/3 of the political economy of universities. We're not talking about the real estate department. We're not talking about the technology transfer department. We're not talking about the medical school. There are so many avenues or aspects of a university that generate wealth off the backs of students and city people that are not even a part of the discussion. We're not talking about foundations that create their own. All the universities are tax exempt, and they become, in the political economy, they become tax shelters for high-level financiers in cities based on their relationship to the universities. And so I'm saying all this to say that if we're gonna have a real reckoning with the force and shape of universities, we have to start having conversations in these macro ways, and then diving deeper into, for example, in Chicago, when residents and students were fighting for the trauma center, it doesn't become a surprise that the police are the front lines to protect the interests of the university and focus the university's interests on boutique medical services as compared to indigent care. And so it's these kinds of relationships and connections that must be a part of any conversation we're ever going to have if it comes to tackling the real problems of universities and political possibility.
Yeah,
Great.
brilliant.
I just want to jump, sorry. I just want to jump in with something that in student organizing that we talk a lot about is basically how, like, knowledge is not power. Like, you have power through organizing with people, through like gathering, your resources together, but like knowledge can help you gain power, but it's not, that's not like the primary way. And I think that's something that really think about in terms of like organizing and our overall like vision of like really transforming or like abolishing the university as it is today. I think like something that's so common, especially at UChicago, which is like, you know, a hyper intellectual kind of like environment where they really encourage, you know, like intellectual, like intellectualness at the expense of like, you know, our physical and mental health. Like UChicago prioritizes so much like knowledge and like knowing in a particular way as a way to like have power, and that's why you see so many students who want to make change on campus really focus on like, you know, doing surveys first, writing reports, like doing this kind of research, when in fact like we already know this. Like if you talk to other people around you, right, that is like the knowledge, like there's already knowledge there, and then when we're engaged in struggle, that's like more knowledge that is like that we are creating together. And so that's why I think for Care Not Cops, like Care Not Cops campaign is like really inseparable from the other campaigns of like UChicago United, where like I think for UC United, like we're really thinking about the university as like a cornerstone of oppression. So it funds it, it reproduces it, it provides the like ideological backbone of it. So like our liberated university that we want to be building towards is one that like doesn't hoard wealth. It has like ethnic studies departments, not just to, you know, like study our own histories or whatever, but it's also to like rethink like other ways of knowing. Like the way I think like as student organizers, sometimes when we go to these classes that, you know, seem so, you know, for lack of a better term, like woke and stuff, but we feel like there's still that disconnect in class, because it's like when we're doing the organizing, we're realizing certain things, we're answering certain questions that like in the classroom you just can't answer. And so like ethnic studies, like for a place to really like prioritize like movement-based knowledges, yeah. And then also like cultural centers is also a campaign of UC United. And that's just also similarly like not just a place to, you know, share culture or like find other people like you, because right, like there is like, we're not like monoliths. Like the experience of like Asian students or Black students, it's like it's not all the same, like internally too. Like what we're really thinking about for cultural centers, it's like spaces for students to like build collectives and like practice their politics together. And that's really like how we're thinking about it, because it's like in student organizing, right? Like we're already building those collectives. Like we have kind of like the blueprint of cultural centers, just like in the work we're doing. Like we're figuring out like the kind of like maybe like unhealthy or toxic behaviors we're having, like we're rooting it to oppression, and we're like learning how to undo it, and we're like struggling together and making sense of it. And that's kind of like I feel like that is really like the foundation of like what we need to like move towards this like liberated world. It's like that chance to like really practice it and like, you know, feel it in your bodies and like work together.
So I want to follow up on that with what Michelle said, and Robin had said this earlier, that institutions tend to reproduce the hierarchies of our society and then legitimize them in various ways ideologically by reproducing the elite, etc. So there's a question here asking you all to think about how do you generate, or how do you do that insurgent intellectual work that Barbara talked about? Where do we find the resources and the capacity to do that work in context or in institutions that are made to do the opposite of that?
Can I just add something? That's a great question. And it goes back to something Devarian was saying, which I think is so important, and that is the relationship between universities and the rest of our society, specifically the land around, or the land upon which the universities are built and established, the communities that are affected, the fact that universities are corporations with a working class population, many of whom don't receive even a living wage, where unions are always attacked. And I think that thinking about knowledge production in that work means rethinking our relationship to each other within the university. Like, you know, ethnic studies, Black studies was imagined initially as something outside of the physical space of the university. It's imagined as a community space in which knowledge production takes place in relationship to communities in struggle. And if we identify with those communities, then fighting for a living wage, thinking about the way that the people who work in custodial services, food services, physical plant, and the people who are being displaced, whose lives are affected by university real estate policies, to work within those. And we have a history of that. That's not even new. I mean, you know, every university I've ever been associated with, from Columbia to NYU, there's always been students and some faculty involved in struggling against the university, as opposed to sort of trying to make it better, trying to sort of improve it on its own terms. So I think that we have to rethink the space in which we do the work, rethink who are knowledge producers, you know, what does that mean? And also rethink the vehicles through which we try to understand our conditions, but also advance a really kind of abolitionist project. And one of the things that's happening right now, I think is very exciting, is the fact that it seems like this is probably the most abolitionist moment in a long time. Though a lot of the demands that we see now and a lot of the knowledge work being done echoes the student wave of 2015. You know, you can hear a lot of that, and I think the groundwork is there. But that's sort of how I see it. But it just means rethinking this false division we have between like the real world and Ivy Tower.
There's no question that if we have a broader sense of knowledge production is producing power, producing relations of production in a broader sense than just simply in the classroom. And so some of the greatest examples that I've seen that are built on the kind of social movement organizing of students and residents from the 60s, thinking about the 1969 campaign in New York City community colleges for open admissions, and a number of the fight against Columbia's attempt to put a gymnasium, Jim Crow, a gymnasium in the middle of Morningside Park. There are a number students taking over Lane Tech and renamed it Malcolm X College in Chicago. The fact that the Black Panther Party in some degree came out of Merritt College in Oakland, California. The university can be the site for reimagining and abolishing, a number of oppressive conditions under which we live. And I've seen within universities, or university as a target point, some important things. For example, calls for living wages, attempts to create housing that is a mixture of student and affordable housing in different places. Seeing calls for community land trusts created by universities, calls for affordable housing trusts created by universities. When people begin to understand the responsibility that tax-exempt universities, both public and private, have to the cities in which the cities, or the spaces more broadly in which they sit, there becomes a greater demand and expectation on the part of these institutions to engage in a way in which they already do, but are very quiet and silent about. And so those are just a couple of examples, but I've been, blessed to see a number of smaller examples, kind of more cellular examples of people speaking back to the current university that is structural and broad, that need to be networked into a broader vision that we see potentially happening right now.
Barbara, do you want to add anything?
I think too, yeah, I can. And Kosi, did you want to say something?
Yeah, but you can go first.
We don't want to be the professors that do all.
No, it's good. You can go first. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I think there are oases on campuses where like-minded people come together to do what we might describe as intellectual insurgent work, or insurgent intellectual work. Slightly different meaning, which way you put it. I think of the Justice Center at Columbia University in New York, which every year does the Beyond the Bars conference, which brings together not only scholars looking at carcerality and policing and so forth, but brings together formerly incarcerated people doing all kinds of organizing advocacy work, and have blurred that boundary, acknowledging reservoirs of knowledge beyond the campus, giving space and power and platform to people, who aren't like credentialed intellectuals and so forth. The Slavery and Justice Center at Brown has done some important things. And I really find a wonderful model at UCLA that Ananya Roy heads, the Democracy and Institute for Democracy and Inclusion. Is that it, Robin?
Inequality.
You're on mute.
Yeah, Institute for Democracy and Inequality.
And Inequality, right? And
Yeah.
Robin's on their board. But if you look at their website, it's, activists, protesting and so forth. I went to a beautiful conference on student debt and financial futures there, which was, unapologetic in terms of looking for justice and change and using resources of the university to help figure some of those things out, which I think is totally not only legitimate within our purview as academics, but it is required of us in this moment. So, if universities can justify partnerships and collaborations with pharmaceutical companies, the goal of which is to make lots of money off of patents, if they can form partnerships with corporations that do enormous damage to human beings and the planet, then we can sure as hell form partnerships with community organizations that want to make the world a better place.
And we all, just real quickly, we also got to go after the Black folk who collude with these institutions, from Obama in the library on down to Black preachers and health workers who have created community development corporations in line with universities as a way to kind of land bank land and property and waiting for development to wash over that chases university developments. So we got to go, we got to attack that as well, just to add that point.
So you want to do some serious truth telling this morning.
Lucy, did you still want to add your comment?
Yeah. Just to comment on what Baldwin just said. All those things are essentially universities' way of asserting a soft colonial power, and especially in these urban areas. And gentrification is essentially urban domestic colonization with the sort of robust colonial apparatus. And to go back to something you also said, Baldwin, I think Kelly mentioned, is sort of harkening back to student activists from the 60s and thinking of these nodes and creating connections within the university to fight against it. Currently, I feel we also try to emulate sort of the principles of those 60s movements, especially that one on California, thinking of the Third World Liberation Movement. But things have gotten way harder for student organizers as universities have really smartened up and leveled up on how to quell our dissent and quell our power. So thinking of how tuition has been rising, and they can hold their scholarships over our heads, right? Also, with these new, the bloated administration with so many offices for diversity and inclusion and so many committees and so many task force, right? In order to give institutional ways that you can voice your concerns, but actually nothing can come from it. And with that increase of a bloated administration and with more levels to the hierarchy, faculty are really critical in helping us build power and helping leverage in coming together and helping us leverage our power against the upper university administration. But that has been really difficult, as there has been some sort of honestly cowardice among some of the faculty that we've talked to, right? They are concerned about tenure, right? The neoliberalization of the academic job market makes their positions really tenuous and really fragile. But it's sort of faculty but we've worked with staff, and staff are easily replaceable. If the university sees that you're helping us, if you're in the Center for Identity and Inclusion or Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, you're gone, you're fired. And we had multiple directors roll through those places because they'll be our allies, and then they'll be fired easily, whereas faculty have some more permanence there. But we've had just so many issues just trying to get those private conversations we have with faculty. We talk to y'all. We know you have these ideals. We know we have your support. We've read your books. We've seen the syllabi for your classes. But then when it comes to sort of really showing up and showing out, it's sort of mute, silent. I think at least in my time here, seeing the faculty letter showing Care Cops' demands and seeing faculty support those demands is great, but it's definitely been a lot of, I don't know, having to really draw it out and pull it out. And thinking of faculty already mobilized amongst themselves to support us, right? So we did this sit-in, they could have just expelled all of us. We were trespassing. we could have lost our scholarships. We could have lost everything as students. Is our faculty ready to rally together and be like, no, these students belong at this university. They are creating the history that we study in our classrooms. They're creating the social spaces that we study in our classrooms and write our books about. Like, they deserve to be here and we will fight for them to be here, right? And so seeing that support from faculty, honestly, wanting faculty to be traitors to their universities, I think, like, betray your university. You know, Fred Moten, be in but not of the university. And I feel like we've just been disappointed in the past seeing so many people be of the university. So,
Kosi, real quick, you know, on the ground terms, beyond kind of allyship and solidarity, could you speak to everybody here? Like, what are the kind of things that you would like to see from faculty in real terms?
Yeah, and Michelle can jump in too.
Yeah,
like,
sorry, I just responded.
No, yeah. Right, so like being like upfront and like confronting upper admin, the presidents, the provosts, the deans, really having our backs when we take these huge risks, really helping with specifically political education, right? So not just focusing on theory, but how are you in your syllabi like incorporating the study of movements, like giving us the tools to like do the work that we do, and not just us like having to put in more time and energy to sort of like get those tools outside of the classroom and then come together and then think of our action and then do our action when we could already like have that knowledge. Having us incorporate the knowledge that we have from organizing into our classrooms, right? I feel like we give so much to the table. It takes a lot of time to be a student organizer. I missed class one day to like do our actions, right? And like allowing that space and understanding the work that we do. But definitely like, if you see something really shady going on upper admin that you know pertains to our work, like, you know, betray them. I feel like, yeah.
I think Robin said something once in Boston Review. I keep referring to Boston Review. I don't know why. I'm not like, anyway, trying to get subscriptions or something. But and it was about also creating space. You know, universities are certain kinds of institutions. They don't belong to us, right? So I think also my own sort of education, I think I've learned more in classrooms outside of campuses. So I think we also have to seize space that we have full control over. That's not about rank, that's not about grades, that's not about, and create those as vibrant centers for making sense of the world. Yes, to the classrooms, you know, as sites for, for radical learning, but also we have to create classrooms, I think, outside the universities, maroon spaces, if you will. I know that's your campus colors, but not related to that. Maroon in the sense of marronage, right? Getting outside of, the organized structures of knowledge under racial capitalism.
And I also just want to throw in one last thing is money. A lot of the organizers are coming from already marginalized backgrounds. We're first generation low income. We are students of color. We're working probably at least 2 to 3 jobs on campus, along with just like scrapping funds here and there. So like, can you create a fellowship? Can you create like grants? Like, how can we in all directions sort of like support the work and like really come together?
I think this might be a good opportunity to close out with a last question. We're coming up on the end of time, and Kosi's last comments around colonize the university as a kind of colonized space, as a colonizing space, makes me think that another kind of context out of which or SSJ emerged was a broader and a really an international conversation about decolonizing the university. So I just want to give each of you a moment to think about how you see defunding the police as a broader kind of, in a broader vision of a transformed university. What would be 1 or 2 things, to keep it brief, that you imagine the decolonized university to look like, or to what values would it have, and how does this conversation and this vision of defunding the university police relate to that broader conception of the university?
Anybody?
Big
I
question.
think, go ahead, Devon.
No, that's the big question. Go ahead. Yeah, I'm punting.
Yeah. Well, I'll have a little answer and then others can build on it in the spirit of collective knowledge production. I mean, there are a myriad of things that we can do, and I think a lot of them we've already named. I think not sort of going along with uncritically the sort of direction that most of our universities are going in. Policing is only one part of it. But again, having universities embrace the mission that corporations have to talk about students as clients sometimes, which I find utterly obscene. So to resist the language and the logic of neoliberalism, to resist the language and the knowledge of coloniality, and look, and to understand that it is a lot of undoing. And I think part of the undoing is not just work inside, but also work outside that puts pressure, right? So, there was a project that was started maybe 5 or 6 years ago called Freedom University. I think some of us were faculty on it. Technically, it was for undocumented students, and we taught classes for free, and then tried to work with students to get actual college credit, and to credential that knowledge and so forth. And it was a little bit of a subversive project but it demanded something of us. It had demanded additional work. It demanded work without, pay. And so I think thinking of the work that we do beyond our paid gigs is really a part of the task, and kind of the spirit of SSJ, really. We're just starting, and it's a modest effort, but thinking of where we get our ideas from, thinking of who we serve, thinking of where is the locus of the work that we do, is a part of that. So it's a recalibration of where we locate ourselves in this whole thing, I think. I mean, that sounds like a vague answer, but I know
right.
I can give you a 20-point list if you want it, but I don't know if that's what's being asked.
Can I follow up on that? Because I'm so glad Barbara mentioned Freedom University, because one of the founders of Freedom University was Lourdes Garcia Pena, who actually has a beautiful interview in the Boston Review. And by the way, I am a contributing editor to the Boston Review, so by way of disclosure. But it's a beautiful interview called Decolonizing the University, and I would suggest everyone read that, among other things. And the question is a really big question, because it's one that I think everyone here in 445 people who are participating probably thought about or thinking about. It's a very hard question, but I just throw a couple things in. One is that, Decolonizing the University is a project of decolonizing this whole earth. And so, as long as we think of the university as somehow separate, then we're going to end up being too focused, kind of like laser vision. But what's, I think, important to acknowledge is that the colonization of the world, a lot of that work comes from university work. The knowledge, universities produce much of the colonial knowledge and colonial processes and colonial relationships. And so, there's a way that it's not simply undoing that, but creating new forms of struggle. And as long as we work within universities only and not in relationship to other struggles, then we'll always be fighting an internal battle that will only reproduce colonial relationships. And then the other thing is that I do want to acknowledge all the different organizations and institutions within universities that are really trying to do that. I just want to make sure that I don't mess up my colleagues' organization and institution, the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, because it's a very important intellectual project run by Ananya Roy. It has been kind of the center and home for a lot of the work that we're doing around divest, invest. And if you're interested, go to challengeinequality.luskin.ucla.edu and check out the website. One of the things that the Institute on Inequality and Democracy does is work with other organizations in community. Two important ones are LA CAN, the Los Angeles Community Action Network, which fights on behalf of the houseless, and not just on behalf of, but our houseless and homeless people. And also groups like, Stop LAPD, Spine Coalition, some of the struggles going on in South Africa around the shack dwellers. I mean, it's a really amazing unit, and I think a model for the kind of decolonial intellectual work that we can do. Just one of many. So I'll stop here.
I guess, and this is going to be based on what I've seen and what people have tried that is not fully come to development, but imagining university space as a common space where everyone is members, the porous lines between city or countryside and campus, obviously the demilitarization of public safety or security and the creation of response teams that are a combination of healthcare and trauma service, and last resort, kind of like direct safety protocols. I've seen, especially in Canada, it's always Canada, right? Examples of housing in the middle of the city that's built by the universities, that is a mixture of market rate, affordable rate, rent geared to income, and there's no difference between the design and quality of the housing. They're all interchangeable. I've seen other places where the food services systems have kicked out Starbucks and kicked out all chains and created their own independent food service systems that particularly target the most difficult to be employed, women of color, recently incarcerated, refugees. And 70% of the workforce of those people, they have they engage in profit sharing and cooperative organizing, and the recipes for that campus food service come from the communities of color from which the workers come from. And these are just small examples, but this is what I imagine by beginning to talk about rethinking, reimagining what a university is. A university as a member, as a neighbor of the community in which they exist, versus a benefactor or a gift. Satellite knowledge spaces directly within communities that are governed by community advisory boards with jurisdictional power and authority to determine the values and the teaching and the knowledge and the working of that institution. So these are the kind of things that I imagine that a university can be reconstructed to do.
In the chat too, I just noticed a number of people, a number of people have cited other campuses. So maybe we can capture some of the resources. My own university, University of Illinois, students are in motion with demands there. Northwestern University students are organizing. Berkeley students are organizing. We would expect nothing else. So, I think all over there are certainly students in motion, and hopefully faculty in tow.
Yeah. And I'm just going to resend the Scholars for Social Justice statement for those of you who have not yet gotten a chance to sign it. You can find it at that Google Docs page. Also visit scholarsforsocialjustice.com, and you can sign up to be a member and be involved in the work we're doing to bridge scholars and social justice movements around the country. I want to thank our wonderful panelists for all their brilliant insights and for this wonderful conversation. I know I learned a lot. I hope everyone else got a lot out of it, and we look forward to the next conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ada?
Yeah.
Are we still, well, it doesn't matter. Is there a way to, there's all these great resources on the side. Is there a way that we can get access to some of that stuff, or
I think that Terry should be able to,
The chat, I asked her to.
okay,
exactly.
To get
I want to make sure, because I'm like, we're in the middle of, I have other stuff going on. I can't take
I know. It's pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got everything.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
No problem. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. That was wonderful.
Lucy and Michelle.
That was great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Peace.